You're probably used to road trips ending in fun destinations or a warm welcome from family. But what if, instead of reaching your goal, you found yourself in a frozen desert, stranded with nothing but snow for miles and your only company being your spouse and infant child? This is exactly what happened to Jennifer and James Stolpa in the winter of 1993. A simple trip to a family gathering turned into an 8-day fight for survival in the middle of the Nevada desert. Their car got stuck in a snowbank, and with no cell phones or any way to call for help, they were left on their own to figure out how to survive the freezing temperatures, ration their limited supplies, and protect their baby. But how did they end up in this situation? And how did they manage to make it out alive when so many others might have given up? Let's go back to the beginning. Jennifer and James Stolpa were a typical young couple, making the kind of trip many of us would recognize. A long drive through tough winter weather, hoping to reach a family event on the other side. James, a private in the U.S. Army, had just returned home from a posting, and they were traveling with their 5-month-old son, Clayton. Their destination was Idaho, where they were planning to attend the funeral of James's grandmother. The Stolpas were in a rush, trying to make it in time despite the heavy snowstorms sweeping through the region. The weather forecast was harsh, but like many of us do, they believed they could make it through. After all, they had a 4-wheel drive pickup truck, and James's military training gave him confidence in dealing with the elements. What could go wrong? But the drive proved to be much more treacherous than they expected. As they crossed into Nevada, the highways began closing due to snowstorms. They weren't familiar with the area and soon found themselves detouring into uncharted roads, hoping to navigate around the closed routes. This decision would lead them straight into a deadly trap, as they took an isolated road that eventually dead-ended in the wilderness. Snow piled up quickly, turning the road into an impassable mess. They were stranded. No GPS, no phone signal, no help in sight. And this is where their true battle began. It's easy to assume that being stuck in snow is a temporary setback, a minor inconvenience that will be solved in a few hours when someone drives by or when the snow lets up. But for Jennifer and James Stolpa, that moment of getting stuck marked the beginning of a long, freezing ordeal. As they drove deeper into the remote Nevada wilderness, the road became more treacherous. What started as a light dusting of snow soon turned into a full-blown storm. The tires of their pickup truck couldn't grip the slick, snow-covered ground. Within moments, they were stuck. James tried everything to free the car, spinning the wheels, digging through the snow, anything to get traction. But nothing worked. As the snowstorm raged on, it became clear that the car was going nowhere. Panic set in. They were miles from the nearest town, without a map, and surrounded by a freezing, barren landscape. Jennifer held their infant son close, her breath visible in the icy air, wondering what they were going to do. Hours passed, and night fell. Temperatures plummeted. The Stolpas had some food with them, mainly baby food for their son, but they had no idea how long it would have to last. The situation was bleak. They knew the snow wasn't going to stop anytime soon, and no one knew where they were. Inside the car, they huddled together for warmth. James knew they couldn't stay there forever. The cold would eventually get to them. But with snow piling up all around them and no visibility beyond the swirling storm, they had no way of knowing where help could come from. The first night was the hardest. Jennifer barely slept, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. The isolation was complete. No lights, no passing cars, not even a hint of civilization. The only sound was the howling wind and the creaking of snow against their truck. It was as if they had disappeared off the face of the earth. By the second day, their food was running low. They decided to ration the small jars of baby food they had, feeding their infant son as little as possible to stretch out the supply. They hoped that rescue would come soon, but as the hours turned into days, that hope started to fade. By the 4th day, it became clear to Jennifer and James Stolpa that waiting for rescue was no longer an option. The snow around their truck had turned into a thick, frozen prison, and with temperatures dipping well below freezing, they knew the clock was ticking. The food supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. Their infant son, Clayton, was still alive, but they couldn't ignore the reality that his tiny body was at risk of freezing. James's military training kicked in. He knew they had to keep moving to avoid freezing to death. But where would they go? With no map and no visible landmarks, they were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by an unforgiving snow-covered desert. They debated their options: stay with the car, where at least they had shelter from the wind or venture out and risk getting lost in the blinding white landscape. They decided that the only hope was to find help. James and Jennifer bundled up in the warmest clothes they had, wrapping baby Clayton tightly in layers of blankets. They packed what little food remained, including the baby food, and set out on foot. It was an incredibly difficult decision, leaving the relative safety of the vehicle to brave the icy wilderness with their baby, but they were determined to survive. The journey started with a slow, painful trudge through knee-deep snow. Every step was exhausting, especially for Jennifer, who was carrying their infant. The cold bit through their layers of clothing and the wind made it hard to see. They were only able to cover a few miles before they were forced to return to the truck to rest. Back at the truck, reality sank in deeper with each passing hour. They knew they couldn't survive much longer in these conditions. James decided he would have to go on alone. Leaving Jennifer and Clayton in the car, he planned to venture out further, hoping to find help. It was a dangerous plan, but they had no other choice. Before James left, they shared a heartbreaking moment, unsure if they would ever see each other again. Jennifer stayed behind. Her only job now was to keep Clayton alive, while James embarked on a desperate search for rescue. It was the only chance they had. With nothing but a makeshift map in his head, James set off into the frozen wasteland, determined to find help. The loneliness was overwhelming, just him, miles of snow, and the biting cold. Every step was a fight against exhaustion. The wind whipped against his face, stinging his exposed skin. His boots crunched through the snow with each laborious step, and his breath froze in the air around him. James was no stranger to tough conditions thanks to his military training, but this was different. There were no comrades, no backup plan, and no end in sight. He had no way of knowing how far he needed to walk or if there was even anyone out there who could help. All he had was determination and the will to survive. As the hours wore on, James began to feel the effects of the cold. His body was getting weaker and every step became harder. He hadn't eaten anything substantial in days, and the extreme temperatures were taking a toll on his endurance. He felt his legs growing numb, and the snow seemed endless. There were moments when he thought about turning back, but the thought of Jennifer and Clayton alone in the car, waiting for him, pushed him forward. After hours of trekking through the snow, James spotted something in the distance, a small cave. It wasn't much, but it offered temporary shelter. Exhausted and freezing, he crawled inside, grateful for a momentary escape from the brutal wind. He huddled there, gathering his strength, knowing he couldn't stay for long. The only thing worse than being out in the snow was the possibility of never finding his way back. James pressed on, walking for what felt like an eternity. Days blended into nights and his body began to give out. Frostbite started setting in and he was running out of energy. But then, in what felt like a miracle, he spotted a road in the distance. He stumbled toward it, hoping against hope that it would lead him to help. Finally, after days of walking, James was found by a passing truck driver who quickly rushed him to safety. But his relief was short-lived, as his thoughts immediately returned to Jennifer and their baby, still out in the cold. Back at the truck, Jennifer was facing her own battle. Left alone with their infant son, she was consumed by fear. Would James find help in time? Would she and Clayton make it through the night? The car, which had once felt like a temporary shelter, now felt like a frozen tomb. The temperature inside had dropped dangerously low and their food supply had run out. Jennifer did everything she could to keep Clayton warm, wrapping him in every available blanket and holding him close to her chest. The baby was growing weaker, and Jennifer's heart ached every time he cried softly, too weak to wail as loudly as before. She knew they were running out of time, but despite the dire circumstances, Jennifer refused to give up Waika. She kept telling herself that James would come back with help. She kept watching the horizon, praying for any sign of movement. The days dragged on, and each night was colder than the last. There were moments when the silence became unbearable, and Jennifer felt utterly alone. After days of searching, James's encounter with the truck driver set a chain of events in motion that would finally bring an end to the Stolpas nightmare. A search and rescue team was immediately dispatched, and they made their way through the harsh Nevada desert in hopes of finding Jennifer and baby Clayton in time. The team knew they were racing against the clock. Jennifer and Clayton had been alone in sub-zero temperatures for days with little food and almost no heat. As the rescue team approached the area where James said they had left the car, the silence was deafening. Every moment stretched out as they scanned the endless expanse of white looking for any sign of life. Finally, in the distance, they spotted the faint outline of a vehicle, partially buried under snow. Inside the vehicle, Jennifer sat clutching her baby, both of them on the edge of survival. When the rescuers knocked on the window, it was like a miracle come to life. The team quickly worked to get Jennifer and Clayton out of the vehicle, wrapping them in blankets and administering first aid. Jennifer, weak and shivering, could barely express her relief. Clayton was still alive but needed immediate medical attention. Jennifer and her infant were airlifted to safety, where they were reunited with James at a nearby hospital. The ordeal was finally over. Against all odds, the Stolpas had survived one of the most harrowing experiences imaginable, thanks to James's determination and the tireless efforts of the search and rescue teams. They had been found just in time. The Stolpas survival story became a national sensation. News outlets across the country covered the couple's harrowing ordeal, and many were astonished that they had survived for 8 days in the freezing conditions of the Nevada desert with an infant. In interviews, James and Jennifer expressed their deep gratitude to the rescuers who had saved their lives and reflected on the choices they had made throughout the ordeal. James was hailed as a hero, but he remained humble, saying he had done what any father would do. He couldn't stop thinking about how lucky they were to have survived and how many times the outcome could have been tragically different. "We had no idea how close we were to not making it," he admitted in one interview. "But I just kept telling myself that I couldn't give up, not with Jennifer and Clayton depending on me." Jennifer, too, reflected on her incredible strength during those dark days. Staying behind with their baby, waiting in the freezing cold, had been a different kind of endurance test. "All I could do was hold Clayton close and pray," she later said. "I believed that James would find help, but there were times when it was hard to keep hope alive. Still, she had held on, driven by the instinct to protect her child no matter what." But for James and Jennifer, the ordeal also served as a deeply personal lesson. They had experienced firsthand the fragility of life and the power of human will. It was a reminder that, even in the most desperate situations, hope and perseverance could make the difference between life and death.